Buenas tardes, bienvenidas, bienvenidos a la Institución Libre de Enseñanza. Los que están en la sala y también los que nos están siguiendo desde donde estén viéndolo. Como ustedes muchos sabrán, esta casa, la Institución Libre de Enseñanza, que es la que organiza este ciclo como los anteriores, en colaboración con la Residencia de Estudiantes y con apoyo del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores. Esta casa fue fundada a partir de un acto de desobediencia. Una serie de profesores universitarios se negaron a acatar una orden del ministro Orobio que exigía firmar una carta de adhesión a la corona y a los principios de la Iglesia Católica. Y en la defensa de la libertad de cátedra se fundó, ese es lo que consagra el artículo 16 de sus estatutos, se fundó la Institución Libre de Enseñanza. Como escribió en plena guerra mundial, Segunda Guerra Mundial, Erich Fromm, en un libro publicado en Estados Unidos en 1941, el acto de desobediencia, como acto de libertad, es el comienzo de la razón. Con muchas diferencias con la situación presente, sin embargo, tenemos que seguir defendiendo la cultura de la libertad en este momento de gran crisis internacional, con unas amenazas ciertas de guerra. Vuelvo a citar a Erich Fromm: el impulso de vida y el de destrucción no son factores mutuamente independientes, sino que son inversamente proporcionales. Cuanto más el impulso vital se ve frustrado, tanto más fuerte resulta el que se dirige a la destrucción. Cuanto más plenamente se realiza la vida, tanto menor es la fuerza de la destructividad. La institución ha querido consagrar una de sus actuales líneas de trabajo a eso que hemos llamado democracia y tolerancia. El fundador de esta casa, Francisco Giner de los Ríos, escribía a Unamuno, ya en la madurez, casi en el final de su vida: yo quisiera que toda mi obra y que toda mi vida fuese entendida como una obra de tolerancia. Eso escribía Giner a Unamuno en 1899. Y bueno, pues en esa línea hemos encargado a una de las autoridades en estos ámbitos, hemos encargado iniciar esa línea de trabajo, una línea de trabajo que lleva ya varios años, con un proyecto de investigación que tiene vocación de ser un proyecto de investigación internacional, con socios internacionales. Estos seminarios también son internacionales y queremos seguir trabajando en esta línea en cooperación con otras instituciones. Fernando Vallespín, que va a ser hoy quien les hable, es catedrático de Ciencia Política de la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, y sus últimos libros son La mentira os hará libres, publicado en Galaxia Gutenberg el año 12, Política y verdad en el Leviatán de Thomas Hobbes, en Tecnos en el 21, y los dos volúmenes estrechamente relacionados con este curso, Populismos, publicado en Alianza en 2017, y La sociedad de la intolerancia, publicado en Galaxia Gutenberg este año. Estos dos últimos libros han sido presentados en esta casa y tienen, como digo, mucho que ver con los temas que estamos y vamos a abordar aquí. Hoy, a la lista de ponentes que figuraban en los programas anteriores, añadimos uno de la catedrática de Yale, Sheila Ben-Habib, que nos parece muy importante que se haya incorporado a la nómina de conferenciantes. Benjamín es una persona muy reconocida por sus trabajos en torno a estos temas, en torno al populismo, en torno a las amenazas de lo que llama ella la contrarrevolución, así va a llamar su próxima conferencia. Yo quiero terminar diciendo que Fernando Vallespín, además de una obra académica muy reconocida, es también un maestro de politólogos. En este propio seminario y en este trabajo hay 2 o 3 jóvenes muy talentosos que han surgido en torno a su trabajo. Una de ellas es ya una persona muy reconocida y editora, ha sido bastantes años del país, y otros están trabajando también en este seminario. Por todo ello, por el futuro que esperamos muy prometedor con él en la Institución Libre de Enseñanza, le queremos agradecer a Fernando todo este esfuerzo y les felicito a ustedes hoy porque vamos a disfrutar de una tarde estupenda. Muchas gracias.
Hello, good evening. Thanks a lot for being here, and thank you, Pepe, for your gentle presentation. So, as you know, the title of my speech is going to be "What's Wrong with the West," and the subtitle is "The Present Dispute on our common values." And you will allow me to start with a rather gloomy quote by Michel Houellebecq from his book Serotonin. I quote, "This is how a civilization dies, without upheavals, without dangers, and without dramas, and with very little carnage. A civilization dies simply out of boredom, out of disgust with itself." End of the quote. As you can see, this is perfectly gloomy quote from another gloomy writer himself, Michel Houellebecq, but in a certain way it expresses a feeling that has set within, that is set within the West, that there's something is not really working in our civilization. And there's a whole lot of new literature that deals with this within the framework of what has been called declinism. That's why I will start with this idea. In a certain sense, it's a feeling that something is not really working with us as it should. So, and I will approach the subject in 2 parts, as I will soon explain. But there's one thing that I'd like to make clear since the beginning. I'm not going to enter into the geopolitical dimension of the subject, because this will be the topic for another of these lectures of the seminar, but also because it would introduce so many nuances that, you know, it would be impossible to deal with everything. Okay, feeling that something is not working as it should. Let me quote John Gray when he says, "The West is not nearing end time." So this is not the apocalypse. Huh? It is simply in decline, a process that is normal in history. So what probably is happening to us is that we are decaying as any other civilization has decayed before. This is, and maybe the cause of it, and this is one of the reasons, I quote Gray again, he says that Western cultures are now too fragmented and introverted to form any clear view of their place in the world. So the problem is that we're facing declinism, the decay, the decadence of our civilization, but we don't really want to grasp the issue. So, and therefore, what we need is diagnosis. Of course, what I will do today is not supposed to be a diagnosis. You know, it will be just a few scattered ideas on how I look at this same subject, and I want to bring it back to the main topic of a seminar, which are the problems with the culture of liberty. But I want to state my point. My point has to do with the idea that the way we understand declinism now has to do with our identity as our civilization. Our identity, both regarding its, what we may call its place in history, I will call it our chronotopos, and I'll explain what it means, and also the dimension of its cultural political dimension. So what we've been defining as the culture of liberty, everything that has to do with our main values, our main principles, and of course with our system of government itself, the liberal democracy. So let's start with what I stated before, the change of our chronotopos. Well, the etymology is quite easy, you know. Oh, okay. The etymology is quite easy to understand. It comes from chronos, time, and topos, place, right? So it's the way we understand our place in time, so our place in history, around how we perceive the evolution of our culture within this particular historical moment and how it differs from the way we used to understand our place in history. And when I say our, I mean, of course, the Western idea. And I think the main problem nowadays lies in the idea that something's happening with modernity itself. And this is what I would like to tackle before everything else, because it has to do with something which I don't like the term, but I think it's necessary at this very point, which is something infrastructural, something that has to do with, with the way, our material base is working. So the modern world has been associated, and I like this thesis on part of a brilliant German social theorist called Hartmut Rosa, has been characterized by the concept of acceleration, Beschleunigung. So, and the main, I'll try to make it simple. What he says is that the logic of dynamic stabilization is the structural principle of modernity. So in the sense that the modern social system can only be dynamically stabilized. So this seems to be a contradiction in terms. In order to be stable, one has not to move. If one moves, one destabilizes. But this is the precise idea. So that in order to maintain ourselves, maintain our system alive, we must be tuned to growth, economic growth, of course, to speed and innovation, right? And this structural principle is also characterized by a certain dynamis that consists in the idea that acceleration accelerates itself, right? So what used to be a leisurely flow between generations, which allowed the world to be perceived individually and collectively within a certain order, happens now within the same generation. So the main social changes now happen within every generation. As you know, millennials are now the old guys, and really, I mean, and millennials are experiencing in their own lives so many changes that, you know, the previous generation, the baby boomers, hadn't experienced heretofore. So this has socio-psychological side effects, because the question is how much acceleration is bearable. As Hartmut Rosa explicitly states, can we put up with not knowing what the world will be like in the next 10 years? How to digest so much scheduled change? So the idea here is that acceleration produces a change in our being in the world. There is no forgiveness for those who are unable to keep up with the accelerated pace of life. And this need to continuously rework social position translates into alienation or existential insecurity. If we don't know what the future has is what we can expect of the future, we really don't know how to live within the present, as we will see immediately. So this has to be combined with what we may call the end of the idea of progress. And let me remind you what we mean by the idea of progress. I like very much this expression of the belief in the availability of history. It's by a German historian called Koselleck. So it's the idea that we can control historical change. That manipulation of the reality that lies ahead, an active modification of the future, depends on our conscious creation, so that it's us who create history. This is the main base that informs the modern identity, the identity of the Enlightenment. It's the identity of Condorcet, Kant, and all the rest. So in a certain way, the future is the task of the present, from where we experience it as a topos that can be accessed through planning and forecasting. So, and this is where the concept of progress comes in, because the concept of progress implies a synthesis between experience, what we have learned from the past, and expectations, what we expect of the future. And this is bound with the idea of there being a constant improvement. The best is yet to come, said President Obama in one of his main speeches. Here is, the whole ideal of progress condensated in one sentence. So that, it's we will be redeemed, not now, but in some place, in some topos, again, in the future. So the general regime of modernity is oriented towards the future as the horizon of open possibilities. The outdated past is continually exchanged for the new in all the fields of human creation, in technology, economics, or politics. So the point, I want to summarize it again. The West takes its identity from the idea of the future as continuous progress, as a resource for survival and permanent improvement of the present situation. But here comes a caveat. Oh yeah, sorry. I went to the future. I want to go to the past. Okay. Let me present you an idea that I find really fascinating. I've read it in and maybe you know Hans Ulrich Gombrich, who's a Romanist. He's not really a sociologist, but he has reflected a lot on time, and he brought in this idea of the broad present, and I'll try to explain it as clearly as I can. So the idea is that the future, he says, the future unfolded as the horizon for action. Now, on the contrary, we are facing a broad present. The past, all of the past, has been incorporated into our present through electronic and automated memory systems. And it is no longer the other that we have left behind. I can use this laptop in order to watch a film from, I don't know, the 1930s. I can read a book of whatever age. It's here and now. It's not something that belongs to the past. We can go to recreate past societies anytime in a museum, or listening to lectures, or whatever. So the past is at our disposal within the present. So the past has not just passed. The present expands more and more, and the future remain, as the scene of the catastrophe, that which will put an end to the extensive present. The future is what differs in an aggravated form from the present. So it is no longer presented as a horizon of open possibilities. It is a dimension increasingly closed to all forecasts, which at the same time begins to be perceived as a threat. What does catastrophe mean? As you know, the etymology of the Greek term catastrophe is, at least we can see it in the Poetics of Aristotle, for instance, is when something turns badly. So when something turns to a terrible ending. So somehow it's the moment that puts an end to a previous order of things, right? And so what Gombrich is saying, that what is happening nowadays is maybe that we have lost that strict separation between past, present, and future. Everything seems to be the present, and we cannot think of the future but as, as a menace. Of course, here we find it in climate change or technological dystopias. Well, you just have to see, most of the Netflix, all the series, most of them are either technological dystopias or they have to do with other kinds of dystopias. So, but I found this extremely interesting because this implies the idea that turns around the way we perceived the future. So the future is no longer the place where we can fulfill all our promises. The future turns to be somehow, the future collapses on the present, so to say. The future turns to be the place to avoid, in a certain sense. So that's also why we are finding now a lot of discourses of, I've called them like this, discourses of regression. There's a posthumous book by Zygmunt Bauman, which is called Retrotopia, where he says that we are now trying to seek in the past, not in the future, the satisfaction of utopian longings, the nostalgia for the idealized past. And we can see it everywhere, you know, the same way we criticize the present by trying to recapture the supposedly better past. You know, this famous sentence by Donald Trump, "Make America Great Again," you know, the MAGA. Well, the idea here is we used to be great, huh? We are not great anymore. Let's return to that past in order to be great again. But curiously enough, it's the same thing. It's the same of what Biden says. So, build back better. So let's try to build as we used to, renew ourselves, you know, in better times, not the kind of this great society, for instance. But even within the left, so it's very difficult to call the left or to consider the left as being progressive. They are more retrotopian, I would say. I mean, they also want to get back to those Trente Glorieuses, you know, of European social democracy. Those 30 years after the Second World War of the social democratic consensus, that's where we had really, you know, a real protective state, where we really we were enjoying a much better society than this neoliberal one, this society based on the market, etc., etc. So the idealized past is longed for because there is no expectation of the future except the need to defend ourselves against it. What makes it, I think this is interesting, what makes it particularly threatening, like climate change or technological development, is that it will be a catastrophe without event. So it's not, you know, the crash of a meteorite, you know, that we're expecting, or the invasion of aliens. What we're expecting is something that we don't fully grasp, which is that famous tipping point, you know, after which, you know, the whole ecological balance is deranged, and then there's no way back, you know, in order to save nature, for instance, or, you know, our livelihood. So, and we don't know when artificial intelligence is going to can be bad for humans, you know, but we know it will happen sometime. So, but, you know, we don't expect an event. We expect something that's silent, that's somehow hidden, you know, even within our own ordinary life. So this was, let's say, the more sociological part of, or the part more of from a socio-theoretical perspective. Now let's go to one of the main theories that we find regarding what we had since the beginning have been called declinism, and this is what we may call the stagnation thesis. The stagnation thesis defines decadence as the absence of progress. So, we don't stop moving, we are accelerated, but that accelerated and frantic change does not seem to make us progress. So we keep moving, but we don't go really anywhere. The thesis here is that the problems are not solved, but remain stable. Society doesn't collapse either. Everything remains more or less the same. The problems are entrenched, they are continuously debated, but the structure remains unchanged. Another German, I'm quoting too many Germans, I'm sorry, but another German sociologist called Andreas Reckwitz calls this the dynamic immobility. Here we have, also, a contradiction in terms. Huh? We can't be, this is that the idea here is that there is no clear, efficient solution, or even in case that there is one, it is not possible to impose it politically. This is important because now, slowly, the political dimension is being incorporated into the discussion. And let me also quote, or at least refer something on part of a book that I did particularly like, is by Ross Douthat. Ross Douthat is an opinion writer for the New York Times. He's a conservative. He's a strange conservative because he's a Catholic as well. So the United States is exotic. But maybe because of his personal status, I think he has an interesting view of the way our society is working. Of course, he looks at the United States mainly, but I think this can be also projected towards other European countries. So, I mean, it's very succinctly what he says is economic stagnation, institutional decay, demographic stagnation, and cultural and intellectual exhaustion. I mean, the decadent society where we have all that under conditions of a high degree of material prosperity and technological development. Think a bit about it. I mean, we are probably the wealthiest and the best societies in the world. Those belonging to the West. And still, this economic stagnation, institutional decay, demographic stagnation, cultural and intellectual exhaustion. Remember the first quote by Wellebeck. So this seems to be contradictory. Because what he says is that we can be rich and innovate technologically and at the same time find ourselves in decline. A society can be decadent without necessarily being on the brink of collapse. Well, he brings in a comparison which I find quite interesting between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the collapse of the West. I mean, it took the Roman Empire about 4 or 5 centuries to finally collapse entirely, right? So we might find ourselves in a similar situation right now, so that we have the feeling that we're declining, but we are still the best, in a lot of respects. Persisting stagnation, he says, chronic disappointment, and a growing contrast between the promise of progress and a reality in which everything seems surprisingly and sadly to remain the same. He puts an example which I found somehow challenging, because when we observe past empires, most of the empires started to decline when they abandoned the idea of gaining more territory, of creating new borders. So that's happened to the Roman, when they stabilized the northern front, the northern border, the Danube and the Rhine, and they looked inwardly. They didn't look outwardly of the society. That was the beginning, somehow, of the end. And he makes a comparison with the United States and says, well, what's the problem with America? Well, America, of course, cannot claim to invade other countries or to expand territorially. It did, of course, and we know it very well with Spaniards, because we lost the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico to them, right? But he looks at it, with the example of the conquest of space, with the Apollo project. That was the new border, right? That we had to trespass. And then after the end of the Challenge project, everything started to change within that society. He gives a lot of examples. I'm not going to enter into them, but it's curious because we can find a connection between one and the other. And so, returning to our situation, not the situation of decay understood as not being capable of progressing. I liked very much a metaphor that can be gained by the philosopher Sloterdijk. This time I won't say that he's a German philosopher, because he presents politics nowadays as and the state, as a repair service. He says that politics remains as pure crisis management. So it only seeks to fix the immediate problems and leaves the structural problems unaddressed. So that's why he calls it the repairing state. So politics always governs behind problems that have practically never been shaped or originated by it. It doesn't lead a project as such, but moves in setbacks, mishaps, or circumstances in which it finds itself involved without really knowing why, but which it inevitably has to compensate for. He also says that our contemporary state should be called the compensating state. Remember the pandemic. What happened? Okay, borders again. The state again, the front, had to repair everything that the virus came from who knows where, but the idea here is that the state has always, to put on, the resources in order to fix most of our main problems, but it goes behind the problems, and so this is the point, right? So a larger political action now only seems possible, I'm quoting now Sloterdijk, as a more extensive repair service. So stagnation, politics as a repair service, gloomy future, that's what we find. So our identity, which was based on the idea of progress, on the modern ideals, starts shaking. And the other part of our identity, the part that has to do with our principles and values, is shaking as well. I don't have much time to enter into this. If you're interested, I've just published this book, La Sociedad de la Intolerancia, where I deal with this problem. So let me focus the main idea. So the identity of the West was associated with a whole normative body: human rights and democracy, the values of liberalism, and with a single form of truth, that provided by science. Let me just mention very briefly, because we discussed everything had to do with post-truth, last time that I was here, but last year. But this is interesting, the way that science can coexist with absolutely maddening conspiratorial ideas. It's absolutely amazing. So we can find at the same time you know, the most sophisticated papers on the virus, and at the same time finds mainly on the net, but also expressed by relevant public figures, absolutely crazy statements on the virus, just to put that example. So this idea that, you know, the only form of truth is that provided by science, we have to probably leave aside. So we defined ourselves by a certain moral political identity, not an ethnic substantial one. That's why we all belong to a common culture called the West. So if this identity, this is a problem, if this identity begins to be questioned, what unifies us? What gives us a minimal cohesion as a civilization? So if we don't agree on the same principles, how can we define what constitutes the we? That would be the point. However, what we're witnessing today is a process in which pluralism is mutating into tribalism, in the proliferation of groups that are increasingly closed in on themselves and less willing to negotiate their differences with those who do not think or feel like them. So this marvelous idea of, no, let's have a public conversation in which, you know, all the differences can be discussed. This has slowly turned into a struggle among tribes. I've repeated the first paragraph, so go to the second. But individualism also turns into identitarianism. So within that conversation, we used to be autonomous individuals guided by our common sense and, you know, a certain and arguments. We were challenged intellectually, and we had to process individually what we believed about everything that was subject to discussion. So that was somehow the presupposition. Now we hardly need to do it. We just have to join a tribe. And most of those tribes are identitarian tribes. There's a very clever American, this time American political scientist called Liliana Mason, who distinguishes between what she calls an identity-based democracy and an issues or issue-based democracy. And her thesis is that we used to be an issue-based democracy, so we were discussing somehow, sometimes bitterly even, we were discussing on certain issues because there was a clash of interests, there were different perspectives at stake, so we have to see how we could impose our own position or our own interest, but, you know, positions on issues were the main matter. Nowadays, we don't need to do that because we simply have to join an identity. So that's the way how American politics now works, which has become somehow, and I think, you know, an absolutely identity-based democracy. And even the way we consume, even our behavior as consumers tends to try to match the patterns of consume of those belonging to the same tribe. In that case, Republicans, let's say, or Democrats. there's an interesting book called Prius or Pickup Truck. Prius, as you know, it's not electric. It's a mixed hybrid. It's a hybrid car, Toyota, and the pickup car, the truck is huge. Well, the title is very expressive. Democrats buy Prius, Republicans buy pickup trucks. Democrats eat vegan. Republicans eat steaks. But I'm simplifying, of course, but it's quite interesting to see, how the patterns tend to fix, and how even people now tend to choose where they want to live, looking for suburbs of Republican voters or of Democratic voters. So it's a society that's really splitting into two. So political conflict appears reduced to different readings of reality. That's called tribal epistemology. Different discourses and identity universes. Those of the in-group and the out-group, as many as there are groups in conflict. So I find myself realized within my in-group, and everything that doesn't belong to my in-group is being seen as alien. Something is not quite belonging to my own identity. So this is the point. And there's another book that I would recommend you. It has been recently translated. I think it's the best book on polarization that I have read so far by Ezra Klein. And here he explains perfectly well how identity issues, how issue-based conflicts are continuously transformed into identity-based conflicts, and that's difficult to solve. So political conflicts are focusing on conflicts of value. There we have the cultural wars. As you know, our country now are facing as well quite important cultural wars, mainly between Vox on the one hand and Podemos on the other, right? So it's practically on everything, this cultural war. Battles over the content of justice, of what justice means, and other values. And here we can find a conflict between wokeism. I don't know if you know what wokeism is this new American identitarian left, per se, highly radicalized. So we have the wokeism versus mainstream liberalism, or mainstream liberalism versus populism. So somehow mainstream liberalism is in the middle, and is being fought from both sides. Just one more thing about wokeness, because of its moral seal. And they were, I like this expression, of course, it has to be by this ironist called John Gray. It's the last heresy of an attenuated Christendom. So somehow it's the last Christians, as dogmatic as were the first Christians, we may say, right? So it's a new way of returning to a strong discourse, a moral discourse. So, and there's this inquisitorial seal that we constantly find, in cancel culture, for instance. It's expressive of this need on their part of trying to reinterpret all our values from a new perspective, which is this identitarian perspective of politics. So there's an open struggle to try to impose our own conception of the good, each one its own conception of the good. The objective is to break the neutrality of the state. As you know, a liberal state is based on the idea that the state doesn't have a conception of the good. The state is not Catholic, nor Islamist, it is not in favor of a worldview or whatever, or Weltanschauung, how we may call it. The liberal state is neutral in questions of value. Not in questions of principle, of course, but in questions of value. And that is, I think, this is the objective on part of populists, but also on part of what we may call this wokeness. It is as if each one of the main conceptions of the good tried to present itself as the only one with the capacity to define how we should all live. I think that's what makes this dispute so terrifying. And now I have my last. It's not here. Now we come to the end. So this is what I call the Russian of liberal political culture. So this illiberal onslaught that we're facing, so populisms in different disguise, and this radical wokeism, and I think there's nothing wrong with being woke, of course, I don't pretend to affirm that. What I criticize is what is being called now, so cancel culture. And I think the result of this illiberal onslaught is that we might be facing the advent of a new era that we may call post-liberalism or post-liberal era. So we might have entered already post-liberal societies. And why do I say this? Well, I think it's obvious there is a retreat of liberal values. We can see it, of course, in the way that opinions are presented. We only see opinionated opinions, so opinions that are presented as if they were dogmas. Every opinion tends to moralize. So it's if every opinion, by definition, an opinion is disputable. If not, it would not be an opinion. It would be a scientific statement, right? It would be a truth. So opinion is something that, might be close to the truth. The opinions differ, and in the way they can be based on more or less effective arguments. But of course, they are far away from a moral principle, a strict moral principle, or a scientific statement. But if we see the way, we just have to see or to hear the way we're discussing nowadays in our public sphere. What's particularly shocking is the way that opinions are presented as if they were really dogmas, and so we're faced with intolerance. Tolerance presupposes that we respect those with whom we disagree. So that respect is no longer there. And this is what makes current liberal politics practically unsustainable. Unsustainable, looked at, seen from the point of view of our values. And then this leads inevitably to polarization. So the more tribal politics tends to be, the more polarized it also ends. We've seen it in the United States, and we're seeing it now regretfully in our own country. So The question is, what can arrest this process of decay? I don't have an answer. I just wanted to bring in this new way of understanding something that, of course, has a dimension that goes very far back in history. We just have to remember, the malaise in our culture. The book by Freud, or Sprengler. The collapse of the West, or the decadence of the West. So there's a lot of literature, but I think we need to redefine it, because we might be entering very dangerous territory, and I'm not just speaking about the Ukraine, of course. Robert Merton, who is one of the classics of sociological theory, said that there are two kinds of prophecies. Self-fulfilling prophecies, which are, of course, prophecies that once they are presented tend to fulfill themselves, and self-defeating prophecies are those prophecies that, because they are being presented, create a reaction in order not to be fulfilled, right? So, and what I try to present here is, in case that it should be a prophecy. I'm not prophesying anything, but I'm trying simply to state how other people are looking at, at what happens in our civilization. But in any case, I think we should take it seriously. So that I think it was also Robert Merton who said, to foresee is to forestall. So if we can see what's ahead of us, maybe we can avoid the worst that might happen, in the future. Thank you very much. Okay, I have to moderate, or maybe you moderate, Javier, right? Pueden hacer preguntas en castellano.
You can ask questions in Spanish as well. Questions in Spanish, I will answer them in Spanish, and the same applies to questions in English.
Javier, ¿tienes tú alguna?
Okay, thank you very much, Fernando, for this inspiring talk. While we wait for more questions from the online audience, I would like to ask you one question myself. So one of the key points of your talk today is that Western societies have lost a sense of progress, which is an interesting concept because during the second half of the 20th century, progress was powerfully associated with ideas such as economic growth, development, or even unlimited material abundance. So do you think that it is possible to recover a certain idea or notion of progress, but at the same time detach it from this ambition of economic growth without limits, which seems to be very dangerous in relation to the ecological crisis?
Yes, it is indeed, but we would need another economic system. We would need another culture, in the end, because we have become a consumer culture. We're used to consume goods. We're used to consume films, consume books, everything, and everything presupposes somehow, a constant production, and it presupposes, there's no way to arresting this. So look at what happened within the pandemic. That's why I started this lecture by talking about acceleration, because I think it was pretty obvious when we entered the lockdown because of the pandemic, that we suddenly realized how accelerated we were, right? So how, and all the enormous amount of things we needed, right? And I can't imagine what would happen if we didn't have the subspace, right? If we didn't have had the internet. I mean, it would be a disaster. So it would be the end of civilization, so to say. So everything could be kept alive simply because of these new technological tools. But even with this new technological tools, so we would have to rewind our whole productive system, everything, you know, and that's even the problem. I think that's, I don't see how we can do it. And if we can be capable of doing it in time, right? So that's, I think it's also a question of time. Of course, we can slowly change, you know, our way of life. We can think of another ways of understanding our being in the world, you know, that's apart from, that's, you know, the one we're used to, but it would take time, and we would need to reshape radically our presuppositions. So I don't think we can regain the idea of progress based simply on growth and innovation, not even innovation. So it would have to be a very soft kind of innovation. Yeah.
It was a very nice talk, but is it not a little bit too pessimistic? I'm thinking on Europe as being kind of like a place in which democracy and tolerance remains, and some of the rights of the minorities are being defended. They are even expanding, some of them, in the recent years. So maybe the idea will be, maybe the world is not buying that idea, or there is risk within it. But is it not truth that Europe is the place in which democracy or liberal democracy is still being defended somehow?
Yes, but look, I think it was 3 Sundays ago, more or less, you know, in El País, there was an interview with Sloterdijk, you know, the philosopher that I had quoted before. And well, he was asked, so how do you see Europe and the rest of the world? And then he said something that I think we need to reflect on it, because he said something like, well, look, we're the best. Everyone would like to live as we live. Everyone would like to have our social protection, would like to have our consumerism possibilities, our consumer possibilities, and everyone would have our wealth, whatever, right? But they don't agree on what we consider to be fundamental, which is our values, which is tolerance, for instance, which is, you know, what we define, we are trying to define here as the culture of liberty. So we haven't been capable of convincing enough people from other cultures that they should join us, because our principles are not our principles. I mean, they are human. I mean, they're based on universalistic principles, right? So, and are you Indian or are you Chinese against torture? Would you like to be tortured? I don't think this has anything to do with ethnicity or with cultural values. I mean, everyone would answer no, right? So why don't we make that universal? But just as, you know, the question of democracy, do we want to govern ourselves, or do we want to depend on someone that orders us how to live, right? Autocracy versus democracy. We saw a couple of days ago, there was in all the newspapers, because we were degraded as a democracy, you know, we were no longer a full democracy. we turned into a defective democracy. There was a lot of talk about, you know, the state of democracy in the world, you know, because of this democracy index that brings every 2 years the magazine The Economist, right? Only 46% of the population live in so-called democracies, more or less. Only 9% of the world lives in full democracies. Why? Well, I think it has a lot to do with values, with principles, with being ready to, or try to obtain, you know, a certain, to satisfy certain values, right? So, but the problem that we're facing is that those very values are being in dispute within ourselves. So they're always subject to different interpretations. But we used to have a different way of dealing with it, not such a dogmatic way of trying to, you know, that every tribe tries to impose their own principles, you know, as theirs being the right interpretation of them, right? And I think that's what has changed. And so what we see, for instance, in what I've called wokeness, is that we cannot rely on an impartial spectator, rational, impartial spectator, in order to tell us what racism is, for instance. This is an example. Only those that belong to a non-white race know when there is racism. So that changes our whole perspective, because there's no common ground in order to face the problems. And what do we see with the populists? So the populists want to return to traditional moral values. Even Putin wants that. This Dugin, no, his guru, his intellectual guru, I don't think he's far from Le Pen or from Abascal, you know, and that crowd. I mean, it's let's return to religion, fatherland, very important. So this nationalism, strong nationalism behind, and common culture with all its peculiarities. So let's not be tolerant to the aliens within ourselves. For instance, Islamists. So that's what's happening. And then what I said, mainstream liberalism has to keep this fight alive, and at the same time without destroying the very foundations on which it is based. And that is, that's really difficult. That's really difficult. I think that's what has changed mainly, right? So this basic consensus on values is being changed, and we can see it every day in the newspapers. I mean, no matter what a judge decides on any issue that has a slight moral content, it will always, he or she will always be criticized to the end, even, you know, drastically. Why? Because it doesn't coincide with the way, you know, an issue is interpreted on part of a certain identity group, most of the times. And I think that's what we are witnessing at the moment.
Bueno, nos van llegando preguntas desde la audiencia online y me gustaría plantear un par de ellas en castellano también para invitar a la audiencia a que nos plantee preguntas en castellano si así lo desea. Jorge Pérez Cerdá plantea: me sorprende que en su exposición y excelente diagnóstico no haya mencionado lo que a mi entender es el nudo gordiano a resolver en el futuro, que es la desigual distribución mundial de la riqueza, la lucha y defensa por los recursos limitados, ¿no? Y él plantea cómo abordar una solución a este problema que se liga a todos los demás. ¿Es posible reconstruir un proyecto netamente occidental desde estas coordenadas? Y esta pregunta se conecta con otra que plantea Javier Méndez sobre la posibilidad de un futuro más allá del capitalismo, del sistema económico capitalista.
Eso no lo sé, si hay un futuro más allá del capitalismo. Desde luego el capitalismo está aguantando mucho y es un auténtico dispositivo, ¿no? Eso que llaman neoliberalismo, ¿no? Que se hace colapsar, digamos, el sistema capitalista con una supuesta ideología que lo sostiene. Yo creo que es algo más que una ideología, que detrás hay verdaderamente algo que estructura todas nuestras sociedades. Pero bueno, esto enlaza con la idea esta de la política como taller de reparaciones, ¿no? Somos conscientes de los problemas de la desigualdad, ¿no? Pero no tenemos la capacidad, sobre todo porque la política, digamos, en un mundo global, digamos, la política es particularista, es decir, la política está encerrada en estados nacionales, mientras que la economía es transnacional, es global. Entonces ahí es donde realmente la política pues busca compensar las disfuncionalidades que genera la desigualdad, pero no tiene un proyecto, no tiene la capacidad para imponer un proyecto que pueda realizarse a largo plazo, sobre todo porque no coinciden los intereses de la mayoría de los actores económicos y nos encontramos continuamente ante paradojas, ¿no? Vamos a ver, el recurso fundamental tradicional, voy a poner un ejemplo muy estúpido, pero para que se entienda de una manera muy clara. El recurso fundamental para la distribución de la riqueza es el sistema fiscal, impuestos. Pero claro, un gobierno de izquierdas como el portugués pues decidió que le compensaba más que no pagaran impuestos los extranjeros que se asentaran en su país, porque generaban más riqueza porque así les consigue incentivar, que si les grava a impuestos. Entonces, claro, muchas veces nos encontramos con que la política funciona en modo chapucero, ¿no? Muchas veces. Claro, eso es lo que quiere. Por eso me gusta la imagen, ¿no? Porque además en España particularmente seguramente tenemos una imagen mucho más chapucera del taller de reparaciones de la que tiene en Alemania, ¿no? Y ahí es donde vemos cómo siempre tienen que estar mirando para un lado o para otro. Y lo hemos visto ahora en esta última campaña electoral en Castilla y León, ¿no? Cómo se saltaba de temas y que ninguno realmente, ¿no?, encontraba una solución o no se veía una solución que estuviera clara. Servían fundamentalmente para poder articular en torno a ellos el conflicto entre los partidos, ¿no? Pero no había una búsqueda convergente de soluciones para esos problemas. Yo creo que debe hacerse esto. O sea, yo creo que hay que poner este tipo de rueda. Yo creo que hay que poner este otro tipo de rueda, ¿eh? O sea, estamos ahí en el taller, pero oiga, miremos a largo plazo, porque yo creo que la pregunta tenía esta idea, ¿no? O sea, que ¿cómo podemos mirar a largo plazo? Y claro, el problema de la democracia es que es cortoplacista. El problema de la democracia es que, digamos, la accountability es a la vuelta de la esquina. Eso sí que es un mundo acelerado. Todo lo que no consiga Biden ahora en los próximos 2-3 meses ya no lo va a conseguir en toda su presidencia. Este es el mundo en el que vivimos, ¿no? Eso es lo que yo traté de sacar a la luz. ¿Cuál es la consecuencia? La consecuencia es esto que nos movemos mucho, no paramos de movernos, como si estuviéramos en una bicicleta estática, pero no avanzamos, no progresamos. Entonces, desde esa perspectiva, no es que estemos estancados, es que estamos decayendo porque se presume que antes sí hubo progreso. Es que este es el elemento interesante, ¿no?, de la tesis esta del estancamiento, ¿no? Es decir, que si nos estancamos, decaemos. O sea que, porque tenemos en el ADN, por así decir, como civilización, la necesidad imperiosa de seguir avanzando. Entonces, claro, y nos han roto el cronotopo, y entonces nos hemos quedado algo que, por ejemplo, que Daudat explica muy bien, nos hemos quedado sin innovación cultural, ¿no? O sea, ¿quiénes son los grandes intelectuales hoy, los grandes filósofos, quienes nos llenan de ideas? ¿Cuánto duran las ideas? Es decir, todo es fugaz. O sea, entonces estamos... Y esto es decadencia. Por supuesto, alguien diría si conseguimos al final, que vamos a conseguir hablar de geopolítica, y la persona que vamos a traer además es clave para esto, es Javier Solana, claro, ahí podemos analizar, digamos, la posición de Occidente respecto al resto desde la perspectiva geopolítica. Pero claro, la perspectiva geopolítica tiene mucha influencia sobre nuestra propia autocomprensión, porque, claro, no nos vemos igual o no nos veíamos igual cuando éramos la potencia hegemónica, cuando todo el mundo deseaba, ¿no?, seguirnos en todas nuestras dimensiones, no solo nuestra capacidad de consumo, etcétera, sino también en, digamos, en nuestro modo de vida y todo lo demás. Ahora simplemente, pues bueno, nosotros hemos creado un tipo de cultura de consumo que ya no está bajo nuestro control, ¿no? Es decir, uno encuentra la misma música en cualquier aeropuerto, encuentra la misma comida en cualquier lugar. O sea, probablemente nosotros fuimos los primeros en poner en marcha este proceso, pero ahora ya no está en nuestras manos. Pero la vieja cultura, ¿no?, eso que escribiríamos con mayúscula, y en singular, esa vieja cultura occidental, eso es perdón por el término, es de frikis, O sea, yo muchas veces me pregunto ahora con el aniversario del Ulises de Joyce, ¿cuánta gente se va a atrever a sentarse a leer el Ulises, ¿no? Es decir, bueno, antes también era una ínfima minoría, o sea, con esto no quiero desprestigiar nuestro tiempo, ahora seguro que hay más gente en términos numéricos que lee este tipo de libros, ¿no? Pero lo que quiero decir es que hay un estado de ánimo. Por eso empecé a lo bestia con Houellebecq, ¿no?, que es el que lo saca más. Porque claro, esta cita uno la lee cuando está acabando ya el libro y dice, claro, pues es que nos estamos suicidando. Es que esta cultura da asco, porque los personajes de Houellebecq dan asco al final, ¿no? Y acaban teniendo asco de sí mismo, ¿no? Y una aprensión hacia su propio mundo, ¿no?, hacia todo lo que le rodea, ¿no?, hacia todo este conjunto de personajes, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, hay un estado de ánimo que está ahí, y luego hay un estado de alerta, que es el que nosotros aquí por lo menos tratamos de expresar, ¿no? Ojo, que estamos jugando con algo, nos estamos jugando algo que es profundamente importante para nuestra identidad como sociedad. Es decir, seguramente podamos vivir reduciendo el consumo. Podremos vivir sin vehículos privados, pero es que no podemos vivir sin libertad. O sea que eso me parece que es muy importante que lo tengamos siempre en cuenta, ¿no? Más, Javier, yo no sé, bueno, me decís a la hora cuando... Vale.
Good evening, Professor Vallespín. Thank you very much for your excellent and very interesting lecture. I actually wanted to ask something that you've touched upon right now. You know, you've focused on the decline of the West, and you said you didn't want to enter into geopolitics, but I was wondering whether you think that there are also other civilizations that are in decline, or if they are in the rise, and how is that a threat to the Western civilization, or how does that affect the Western civilization?
That's a great question, because that's something, because it allows me to say something that I wanted to put into my presentation, but of course I didn't have the time. You know that what makes us different being just as modern as the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is also accelerating, is modernizing, you know, in the sense of growing and developing. What makes us different is that the rest of the world still has to catch up to get to a level, right, of at least a level of wealth or of education or whatever, right? So in that sense, I mean, they don't feel, I mean, they don't have, I mean, they have adopted something that's Western, which is the idea of modernity based on the idea of progress, but they have incorporated into their culture without, you know, without creating, so to say, something alien to the culture. So you look at the Chinese culture, for instance, and modernization. I mean, they have adapted perfectly well, right? So, and I mean this, and they, I mean, I don't think that they believe that they are, I mean, they are accelerating and they're constantly moving, but not progressing. They are progressing. So they just have to look back, you know, the last 20 years. But if someone from the left in any European country, not to talk about the United States, looks perhaps 30 or 20 years back, they may say, well, maybe our ordinary life was better. So, you know, life was not so competitive, everything, you know, went slowly. I mean, in that sense, I think that makes a difference, right? But the main difference is that, I mean, you feel you're progressing when you still have to catch up, and, you know, and to get at least to that level of development as we have in the West. But then on the other hand, when another civilization felt threatened by what we may call Westernization, Hollywoodization, or Western morality, I'm thinking of Islam, for instance. What did they do? I mean, they reacted by turning fundamentalists. So fundamentalism, I think I read it in a book by, who was it, by Anthony Giddens. He said that fundamentalism is a reaction to globalization. Before globalization, our culture was pure, right? So we were not affected by foreign viruses, foreign mores, foreign ways of life. Now everything's open. Everyone can look into our society, and our society can look into other societies. And so in that sense, and that creates, you know, in order to defend what you think is your identity, you turn you radicalize your identity. It's the same thing that we see with neo-populisms in Europe. So it's, you know, I mean, it's a return to the roots of real Germans. So, wir sind das Volk, you know, we are the people, the real one, not those Turks, not the other one. We are the ones that still consider us being the real Germans. Real Islam is Orthodox Islam, so we don't want to play with that. So in that sense, I think there's a difference, you know, in the perception. You know, they may suffer from other problems, but they have probably more to do with how to have a better economy, how to get, you know, better and more growth, how to innovate, how to be more competitive. But I don't think that they have this mixture that we have between, on the one hand, seeing that our identity is moderns, you know, accelerated moderns on the one hand, and our identity is being liberals, you know, to simplify. This other part of the Enlightenment heritage might be threatened. And I do believe that it is threatened. So I'm convinced of it. But thank you for your question. You want to ask? I thought you wanted me to finish. Pensé que querías que acabara.
Procuraré no enrollarme, que ya es muy tarde.
Bueno.
No, yo me parece que es clave lo que planteas, la amenaza que se cierne en tantos campos. Yo no estaría tan seguro, yo quizá no comparto que este sea un momento de pobreza, de más pobreza cultural. ¿Dónde se está ahora creando la siguiente obra maestra? Yo no estoy tan seguro de que ahora no esté habiendo un nivel de creación de obras maestras.
Somos 8.000 millones.
Por eso, yo no estoy tan seguro.
Seguro que hay.
Por eso, quizá eso. Yo en eso no comparto, yo no soy tan pesimista en cuanto al desarrollo de la cultura, por no decir que en este momento la cultura, y hablo por cultura, la gran cultura, no solamente en las formas que nosotros conocemos, admitamos un poquito de Netflix en eso y un poquito de la gran cultura, pues sí que está teniendo acceso a ella mucha más gente que antes. Realmente en ese sentido, yo no soy... Pero eso no quita el otro problema. Eso no quita... Lo que sí que creo que, supongo que esto lo tenéis muy estudiado y hay que hablar mucho de ello, es que en Occidente y en los últimos 100 años, los populismos, las intolerancias, los tribalismos, no son la primera vez que los tenemos cerca. La cuestión es que después de los millones de muertos de la Segunda Gran Guerra, cómo ha vuelto a resurgir. Eso que le hemos leído y le hemos oído a Jorge Semprún, que en la misma colina por donde Goethe paseaba con Eckermann, los que han leído y se han educado en Goethe construyeron uno de los campos de exterminio más grandes. Por esas mismas colinas de Goethe,
sí, Weimar.
Pues realmente que después de eso nuevamente vuelvan a surgir, no estoy diciendo que sean los mismos, pero que nuevamente vuelvan a surgir los populismos y los tribalismos, pues realmente es de preocupar, porque dices, bueno, ¿cómo ha funcionado la educación? En fin, ese es el problema. Yo sí que creo que no es la primera vez, es decir, el lenguaje de los 30, los intelectuales, la gente formada, ves con sorpresa como muchos de ellos, e incluso de los grandes, se expresaban en unos términos muy intolerantes y también con un espíritu muy tribal, muy de los míos frente a los otros, el otro es el enemigo. Es decir, que esto, o sea, estudiar, digamos, cómo es la intolerancia de los 30, pues a lo mejor puede esclarecer algo. Pero sí que estoy de acuerdo básicamente, y creo que ahí agradezco muchísimo lo que has hecho. Creo que hay mucho, por tanto mi pregunta, vamos, me aterrorizaría que la contestaras, porque dada la hora. Pero
O sea, que lo que tú quieres es que te dé la razón.
No, en absoluto. Pero creo que hay mucho que trabajar en esta línea que has planteado. Yo ya digo, dentro de la discrepancia, en lo que se refiere al juicio sobre la gran cultura, pero la cuestión no es esa, la cuestión son las amenazas. Las amenazas
Claro.
que...
No, yo lo decía citando a Doudat, porque yo no puedo caer en lo mismo que he estado denunciando del discurso de la regresión, ¿no? Eso de hubo un momento en que América fue grande, hubo un momento en que España, ¿no? Que en el Imperio Español no se ponía al sol. No, yo lo que quiero decir es que ahora hay un elemento que es, y con esto acabo, hay un elemento que es radicalmente nuevo en lo que está ocurriendo, digamos, en los discursos decadentistas, que es como nosotros podemos traducirlo de declinismo, ¿no? Que es el declinismo del periodo de entreguerras, ¿no? El de Freud, el de Spengler, el de y tutti quanti, ¿no? Era un declinismo donde realmente allí lo que era el momento en el que el mundo moderno amenazaba con comerse del todo el viejo mundo, ¿no? El aristocrático y digamos, las viejas comunidades, incluso comunidades nacionales, ¿no? Entonces, claro, ahí es ese contraste entre cultura y civilización, ¿no? La cultura era lo bueno, la civilización lo malo, etcétera, ¿no? Settembrini, ¿no? Pues banal, no sé qué, nafta es racional y tal, pero es auténtico, ¿no? O sea que ahora estamos en otra clave, ¿no? O sea, nuestra clave es que claro, la civilización se monta precisamente sobre la idea de que esto va a seguir adelante, o sea, que seguimos progresando y de repente nos damos cuenta de que no, hay que parar, que es que nos han dicho ya que el planeta tiene un tope, etcétera, ¿no? Y claro, esto nos obliga a tener que reformular, ¿no? Cuál es nuestra posición y cómo podemos ir marcha atrás y, como decía antes Javier, y a la vez imaginar que estamos progresando por el hecho de ir hacia atrás. O sea, imaginemos lo que significa como ruptura, digamos, de nuestra concepción del mundo, ¿no? Pero no tenemos más remedio. Veo que la gente dice así, que no. Bueno, lo dejamos aquí entonces. Muy bien, muchísimas gracias, ¿eh?